Welcome! It's great to have you back. This set of videos is going to be talking about Chapter 2 in the core textbook, which is officially titled Technology, Population, and Growth, but for our purposes is going to have a much more constrained set of information that we're covering. We can figure out how to get the screen to move. Okay. So the overview of this chapter, broadly speaking, is to talk about growth and technology over time, economic models in general, incentives and economic decisions, innovation and competition, and virtuous and vicious cycles. We are, for the purposes of Econ 202, really only going to be focusing on the first, the central three concepts here. The idea of economic models in general, incentives and economic decisions, and innovation and competition. In the past, when I've done this whole chapter, we've gotten into a lot of detail that has mostly had applications for microeconomics, so we're really limiting focus this time around. Okay, so there are several overarching questions for Chapter 2 in your textbook. And what I think they're most helpful in illustrating is the notion that economic knowledge isn't fixed in time. It changes. People's ideas about the relationship between different variables changes over time, and that has implications for how people understand the world around them, how they influence policy, and they influence business behavior, and so on. So some things to keep in mind as you're reading the intro to the chapter is, one, what was the Malthusian model of economic growth? What assumptions did Thomas Malthus make about how the economy behaved, how people acted, and the implications of that for economic growth? Two, why did economists eventually reject it? They subscribed to the ideas that Malthus put forward for hundreds of years, basically. But it was only in the 20th century that economists really rejected the ideas that Thomas Malthus put forward. And then finally, what does this tell us about models and economic thought over time? In my opinion, it shows us that economic thought is flexible. It's fluid and it changes, and it reflects the way people understand the world, and it has implications for how people explain the world and behave within it. Okay. Models in the big picture. What are they? What do they do? Well, in economics, a model is supposed to capture the elements of the economy that we think matter for our question. They're supposed to describe how agents act and how they interact with each other and the elements of the model. 3, they determine the outcomes of these actions. This is what we consider to be an equilibrium. And then finally, they help us study what happens or predict what might happen if things change. So let's think back to micro. The model that most people remember coming out of micro is the model of supply and demand. How does the model of supply and demand map out to these 4 criteria? Well, 1, it captures the elements of the economy that we think matter for the question. And in that case, the question is, how does the quantity people demand of something change as its price changes? How does the quantity that a firm is willing to supply of a particular good change as its price changes? 2, how do agents act and how do they interact with each other? Well, we assume that if firms behave in such a way that leads to a decrease in the price of their output, that's going to have implications for the price that consumers have to pay, and that will have implications for the quantity of whatever good or service customers are actually going to buy. This works in the reverse too. If something happens to change consumer behavior, to change their willingness to buy certain goods at a certain price, that's going to have implications for the quantity of stuff that firms are going to be willing to supply. So a change in demand should lead to a change in the quantity supplied, and vice versa. A change in supply at all prices should lead to a change in the quantity demanded in the short run. Determine the outcomes of these actions. Well, we assume that if firms are producing more output at a high price than customers are willing to purchase, that there's going to be some flexibility. Something is going to have to change, assuming firms want to sell all the output that they've produced. So a firm may find itself forced to lower the prices of certain goods and services in order to clear out inventory. This may not apply if we're talking about something like a service. Like if I charge a high price for my consulting business and people aren't willing to buy it, I may lower the price to see my business expand, but it's not like I have a backlog of hours that I have to get rid of. When you hear equilibrium, what sorts of thoughts occur to you in the economic context? If you're thinking about a model, how would you show equilibrium in a model? This is something to consider as we think about models that we're going to be looking at over the course of the semester.